Welcome to True Crime Threads, where hidden truths unravel one chilling story at a time. In today's episode, a seemingly perfect marriage hides a dark and twisted family conspiracy you won't see coming. In a quiet suburb of Michigan, Elena Foster lived what looked like the perfect life. She was 29 years old, worked as a school librarian, and had been married to Dr. Thomas Grant, a respected local physician, for 3 years. Friends admired their relationship, often calling them the ideal couple. Elena's social media was filled with snapshots of their charming life together, home-cooked meals on their dining table, county holiday getaways, weekend hikes in the nearby woods, and cheerful family gatherings during the festive season. From the outside, their life looked settled and content, as if nothing could possibly disturb their happiness. Thomas was everything one would expect in a supportive partner. He was well-spoken, intelligent, and had a calm demeanor that made people trust him instantly. Elena often received compliments about how lucky she was to have him. They had a lovely two-story home in a leafy neighborhood, with wide sidewalks and friendly neighbors who waved from across the street. It was the kind of life Elena had dreamed of, growing up stable, safe, and surrounded by love. But there was one element of her life that Elena couldn't fully embrace: her mother-in-law, Margot Grant. Margot was a retired nurse who lived just a few blocks away. She had always been involved in their lives, perhaps more than necessary. From the moment Elena married Thomas, Margot inserted herself into every corner of their routine. She would stop by unannounced, often using her own spare key. She offered unsolicited advice on how Elena should keep the house, cook meals, and even dress. She showed up at every family dinner with dishes of her own, regardless of whether Elena had already planned the menu. Sometimes it felt as if Margot believed she was still the woman of the house. At first, Elena brushed it off as typical mother-in-law behavior. She tried to be understanding, thinking maybe Margot simply had a hard time letting go of her only son. After all, Thomas seemed close to his mother, and Elena didn't want to come between them. She smiled through uncomfortable moments and ignored small red flags, convincing herself that over time, things would improve. But instead of backing off, Margot became more present. She called daily, asked overly personal questions, and made passive remarks that left Elena feeling criticized. Despite the tension, Elena never mentioned much to her friends or family. She didn't want to seem ungrateful or dramatic. She had married into a good family, and she was determined to make it work. However, there were moments, small, fleeting, honest, that made her pause. Sometimes when she entered a room, Margot would stop talking abruptly. On other occasions, she caught strange looks passing between Thomas and his mother. These moments didn't make sense at the time, so she ignored them. Everything seemed stable, even if not perfect. Elena had no real reason to believe that anything sinister was going on. She went about her daily life, shelving books at the library, making dinner in the evenings, and planning weekend outings with Thomas. She wanted to believe that whatever discomfort she felt would pass, but that was before the unexplained illness began, an illness that would slowly unravel everything she thought she knew about her husband and the woman who called herself family. It started gradually at first, just occasional headaches and moments of dizziness that Elena attributed to long hours at work or lack of sleep. Then came persistent nausea, a sense of exhaustion that lingered even after resting, and a feeling that something wasn't quite right. She visited her doctor, who ran standard tests and found nothing unusual. They told her it could be stress or a minor hormonal imbalance. Nothing to worry about. Elena accepted the explanation for a while, but her symptoms didn't go away. In fact, they got worse. Soon, she began losing weight without trying. Her appetite shrank, and she noticed strange bruises appearing on her arms and legs without explanation. There were days when her vision blurred slightly, and she felt a strange weakness in her limbs. The timing of the symptoms seemed unpredictable, but over time, she noticed they often flared up shortly after she'd eaten a meal prepared at home. She thought it might be a food intolerance, but the inconsistency made it hard to identify a clear cause. Thomas, ever the calm and composed doctor, dismissed her concerns gently. He told her she was probably just anxious or run down, that her mind was tricking her into believing something was wrong. Margot echoed his words, brushing off Elena's complaints as nerves or attention-seeking. They both acted as though her fears were irrational. Still, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her body was reacting to something more than stress. One night, after a particularly bad wave of nausea, Elena lay in bed and began to think back over the past few weeks. She remembered which meals had made her sickest and who had prepared them. A pattern began to form. On several occasions, she had started to feel unwell after Thomas had insisted on cooking. On others, Margot had brought over food just before the symptoms began. The connection was subtle, but impossible to ignore once she started paying attention. Elena decided to begin recording everything that she ate, how she felt afterward, who was present, and the time of day. She kept a private notebook tucked inside a drawer, carefully logging each detail with dates and symptoms. She noticed her condition was stable whenever she prepared her own meals, especially on the rare days she ate alone. The pattern became more disturbing as the days passed. It seemed as though the illness was being triggered intentionally. She didn't want to believe it. The idea that someone might be causing her harm was terrifying, especially when that someone could be her husband or his mother. But the data she was collecting didn't lie. The evidence was stacking up in front of her, and no medical explanation could account for it. Adding to her unease was the way Thomas always seemed to leave the house, not long after Margot arrived. Sometimes he claimed it was a last-minute patient call. Other times he said he needed to run errands. The timing struck her as too convenient, as if his mother always had time alone in the house with her when he was away. The thought chilled her. Still, she wasn't ready to go to the police. Something in her told her she needed more proof, concrete, undeniable proof. She needed to see it with her own eyes. Until then, she would keep collecting information, quietly and carefully, hoping she wasn't too late. Elena knew she couldn't rely on suspicion alone. She needed evidence of something real, something undeniable. Quietly and without telling anyone, she ordered a small hidden camera online. It looked like an ordinary charger and could easily blend in among the cookbooks and kitchen appliances. When it arrived, she placed it carefully on a shelf in the corner of the kitchen, making sure it captured the food preparation area clearly. She tested it twice to be sure it worked, then left it running. The footage would record silently, storing everything on a small memory card. She didn't know what she would find, or if she would find anything at all, but it was her only option. For nearly 2 weeks, Elena acted as if everything was normal. She went through her daily routine, spoke politely with Margot, and even thanked Thomas when he made dinner. Inside, she was filled with tension. Every bite she took felt like a risk. She continued keeping notes in her journal, matching symptoms with specific meals, just as she had before. The only difference now was that her observations would be backed by video. The camera became her silent witness, recording every movement, every moment, every suspicious glance or gesture. At the end of the second week, Elena retrieved the memory card and loaded the footage onto her laptop late one night. While Thomas was asleep, she watched hour after hour of uneventful recordings. Margot entering the kitchen, Thomas stirring pots, the usual routine. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then, on the 5th day, the tone shifted. Elena watched as Margot entered the kitchen alone, removed a small vial from her handbag, and stirred its contents into a mug. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Margot looked over her shoulder, quickly tucked the vial back into her bag, and left the room as if nothing had happened. On another day, the camera captured Thomas opening a locked drawer near the stove, pulling out a bottle wrapped in cloth, and adding a few drops into a simmering pot. He moved calmly, efficiently, without hesitation. The look on his face never changed. To anyone else, it would seem like ordinary cooking, but Elena now understood what she was seeing. Her husband and his mother were putting something into her food deliberately, carefully, with full knowledge of the consequences. Elena Saturday frowning in front of her laptop. The people she lived with, the people who claimed to love her, were actively hurting her. The truth was worse than anything she had imagined. She copied the footage onto a separate drive and hid it in her car. She also made a backup and stored it at a friend's house, just in case. The footage alone was enough to raise alarm, but she still didn't understand why they were doing it. What did they have to gain? What could possibly justify such cruelty? Though shaken, Elena wasn't ready to confront them yet. Something told her there was more to the story. She needed answers, not just for her own safety, but for her sanity. The people she trusted most were hiding something far deeper than she could have ever guessed. If she wanted the full truth, she had to keep going, and that meant looking into the past. Elena began searching through anything she could find about Thomas and his family. She looked through public records, old news articles, and medical licensing information. Most of it seemed normal on the surface, but she kept digging. One evening, while scrolling through archived obituaries, she came across a name that caught her off guard: Lillian Brandt. The obituary listed her as Thomas's first wife. Elena stared at the screen in disbelief. Thomas had never mentioned being married before, not even once. They had spoken about their past early in their relationship, or so she thought. Lillian's name had never come up. Curious and unsettled, Elena searched further. Lillian had died 5 years earlier, and her cause of death was listed as accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. According to a local article, she had been found unresponsive in the garage of her home. It had been ruled a tragic accident. The article was short, and the details were vague. Something about it didn't sit right with Elena. The similarity between Lillian's sudden death and her own unexplained illness was impossible to ignore. She tracked down Lillian's surviving sister through a genealogy website and reached out with a cautious message. A few days later, the sister replied and agreed to speak privately. What Elena heard left her shaken. Lillian had complained of strange health problems in the months leading up to her death: dizziness, nausea, and fatigue. Doctors found nothing wrong. Family members assumed it was stress or depression. Margot had been living with them at the time, supposedly helping out during Lillian's health struggles. The sister had always thought something about the death felt off, but there had never been proof. Elena compared the symptoms and circumstances to her own. The timeline, the reactions from Thomas and Margot, even the subtle dismissals of concern of it aligned closely. The eerie parallels were impossible to overlook. It felt as though history was repeating itself. She gathered everything she had: her journal, the video footage, and now this new connection, and brought it to the authorities. She explained her suspicions, provided the evidence, and asked them to reopen Lillian's case. The police took her claims seriously. The footage alone warranted further investigation. When they revisited Lillian's autopsy and toxicology reports, inconsistencies were found. Certain results had been signed off without follow-up testing. One chemical level, previously dismissed as a lab error, matched substances identified in Elena's footage. This time, the authorities pushed harder. Soon, a fuller picture began to emerge. Lillian's case had been quietly closed without much scrutiny. Margot's background as a nurse meant she had knowledge of how to administer small, untraceable doses of harmful substances. Thomas, with his medical connections, had access to drugs that wouldn't raise immediate red flags. Their combined roles allowed them to manipulate both the environment and the narrative. Lillian had been a victim, and Elena had nearly followed the same path. As evidence piled up, law enforcement moved forward. What started as one woman's quiet suspicion had unraveled a carefully hidden pattern. The Grant's past was no longer a private matter. It had become a criminal investigation, and the truth they had concealed for years was finally beginning to surface. Elena was no longer just a victim. She was the key to exposing everything. It didn't take long for the investigation to accelerate. With the footage, the journal, and the toxicology inconsistencies from Lillian's case, authorities had enough to move forward. Both Thomas and Margot were arrested at their home early one morning. The neighborhood watched in disbelief as the respected doctor and his elderly mother were led into police cars. Elena remained inside, watching from the window, her heart racing but her hands steady. The people she had once trusted above all else were being taken away, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. As the investigation deepened, more disturbing details surfaced. Thomas and Margot had been covering up their actions for years. Interviews with former colleagues revealed that Thomas had quietly changed hospitals after Lillian's death. There were whispers of suspicious conduct, but nothing had ever been proven. Margot had worked in several medical clinics after retirement, often volunteering to help with medication sorting or patient observation. Her access to controlled substances, paired with her medical background, allowed her to act without drawing suspicion. They operated not with recklessness, but with patience and precision. During interrogations, Thomas remained calm and detached. He denied everything, claiming Elena had imagined the whole thing. But Margot was less composed. When shown the footage from the hidden camera, she broke. Investigators reported that her statements hinted at a belief that she had been protecting her son from women who tried to control him. In her mind, she wasn't doing harsh, was removing obstacles. That reasoning had shaped everything she did. To her, Elena was just another threat that needed to be eliminated. Court proceedings began months later. The courtroom was filled with reporters, neighbors, former patients, and people who had once admired Thomas. The footage was played publicly, and Elena's detailed journal was entered as evidence. Witness after witness testified about Margot's invasive behavior and Thomas's distant, often controlling personality. The prosecution built a clear case. This wasn't a one-time act. It was a pattern of manipulation, abuse, and silent cruelty. The defense attempted to cast doubt on Elena's mental state, suggesting she had fabricated or exaggerated her claims. But the evidence was too solid, the timeline too consistent. A forensic toxicologist testified that substances used in the poisoning were difficult to detect in small amounts and required specific testing not performed during standard exams. With that, the last gap in the prosecution's case was sealed. Thomas and Margot were both convicted. Margot received a life sentence without parole. Thomas, found guilty of conspiracy and attempted murder, received multiple decades in prison. As the verdict was read, Elena sat quietly in the courtroom, her expression unreadable. She had survived what others had not. Her voice had brought justice. After the trial, Elena moved away from Michigan. She never returned to the house she once called home. In interviews, she explained that she no longer looked for perfect appearances or charming words. She had learned that danger could hide behind calm voices and familiar faces. Her life would never be the same, but she had found something more powerful than calm clarity. And in the end, that clarity had saved her life.